The mysterious art of tuning, is it art or science? Well, we've got Charlie Cumbley from North Sales to help us out with that. Hi, my name's Andy Rice from salejuice.com. And Charlie, it is a bit art, a bit science, I guess. But yeah, what's your take on the basic principles of tuning? And I mean, well, let me firstly say that you've been across the whole gamut of dinghy racing and keelboat racing. We'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. But what are the very broad principles of tuning, starting from the basics?
So with tuning, you're obviously trying to get a balance of performance of upwind and downwind for whatever given boat you've got. And depending on your class, it will decide what adjustments you're allowed to make onshore, and also what you're physically able to adjust onshore, what you're available, you have to adjust on the water or racing. So for any given keelboat, for example, if you're starting from scratch and you haven't got any tuning guide whatsoever, any idea of numbers, then using something that's comparable of similar size that you might be able to get some details of will certainly get you in the ballpark with regards to getting your loose gauge, getting it onto your shrouds, and providing a number, just to start the process, because sometimes it's a longer process than you want it to be. So just by getting right, so this is a 25-foot keelboat, and we're going to look at some base stock tune numbers of, say, 20 on your shrouds and 15 on your lowers, and going on the water and sailing. And then the key part then is learning while you're on the water what you're trying to achieve and how the boat feels. So you're looking at rudder angle or weather helm. Has the boat got too much helm going upwind? Has it got too little? Do you need to add rake into the boat to add some helm, or vice versa? Is it too helmy and you need to decrease and set the mast more upright? And obviously that has an effect on your downwind performance as well. So you're always trying to get this little balance of getting the boat nicely set up upwind. Ideally, if you go out in 12 knots, that's your kind of average base, 10 to 12 knots. Boats generally are starting to get powered up at that space in that sort of time. And then you can work from that point. So, the classic of going upwind, even it applies to dinghies up to small keelboats. If you're going upwind in 10, 12 knots, is your leeward shroud just starting to release when you're going upwind? That'll kind of give you a little bit of a basis of, are we too tight on the rig? Are we too loose on the rig? So there's little principles like that you can use, and that you can then just write those numbers down and go, right, where do we go from here? For the lighter airs, okay, we can probably start slackening off the shroud tensions, or do we need to adjust the mast rake in the lighter airs to get more helm, more feel on the boat, which will improve the upwind performance? And vice versa, as you start going up the range in wind, you're looking at obviously starting to tighten everything down. How much is that leeward shroud swinging in the breeze? How much helm do you have? Is the tiller up around your ears because the boat's so imbalanced? So there's definitely some principles you can use across the classes. And sometimes it obviously takes a little bit longer and more time on the water to do that. And that's why, you look at any popular classes and, keelboat classes, J70 and Etchells, there's a pretty refined tuning guide that's out there, purely because a lot of time has been spent looking at the rigs, looking at the sails. So they're quite refined packages, whereas you go into a new class or less popular classes, for example, and where people have spent less time, and you probably get a little bit more of a generic setup or tuning guide, even if there is a tuning guide.
Yeah, so when it's a brand new class, obviously everyone is learning, and the numbers are going to take a while to lock down. But let's say you're going into an established class where there are lots of numbers available. Let me present to you two scenarios. I mean, one would be that you go to the North Sales tuning guide and you set your boat up exactly to that, and you learn how to sail the boat as quickly as possible from those numbers, and you don't question the wisdom of those numbers too much. On the other hand, Adam May, ex-Olympic sailor, current Olympic coach, his piece of advice I've heard is you get in a new boat and you go to the absolute extremes of everything. You try massive amounts of mass rate back, mass rate forwards, and just experience what that does to the boat, and the effect that it has. So if you're getting into a brand new class, where would you sit between those two principles?
It probably depends on how much time you've got in reality. I mean, so many people, it's time dependent. They get the boat, on the Friday, they're putting the rig up and they're like, right, we need to go racing this weekend. I think if you've got a tuning guide on a refined class, like a J70, like we discussed, it's a real quick way of getting 90% of the way there with minimal effort. And I totally get where Adam's coming from, because if you try those extremes, you then get to feel how the boat feels with those setups. But actually, that takes quite a bit of time. And obviously, the Olympic guys, full-time sailors, they can absolutely do that. I think for you, sort of Mr. Joe Bloggs, who's come off the street, bought a keel boat and wants to go racing at the weekend, tuning guides are. And I get your point, because people sometimes get so focused on tuning guides. The number of conversations you come in and like, oh, what were you on today? What are the numbers? And you're like, well, we decided on this, but actually you could get away with a bit more backstay, and so we didn't touch it all day, whatever it might be. So they're a great basis, but they're not gospel, I think, is the bottom line.
Yeah.
So if you just want to get out there, get your boat on the numbers, it's a great way of just going out and knowing that you are going to be competitive. And then you can refine it.
Sorry, how often do you find that old thing of beginners, like that someone gets into a new class for the first time and they start doing really well, maybe even on day one, and maybe that's because they're focusing on their heads out of the boat, because they don't know what to look at in the boat.
Exactly.
Tell us about that, if you've experienced that yourself.
So true. And I think that you hit the nail on the head there. Some people are so focused on the numbers and looking inside the boat that you go out on a shifty northerly on the Solent, and setup has got so little in reality to the overall scores, while they're in looking at whether they're lured shroud slack or if they've got enough main sheet tension. They've just missed the 20 degree shift that they've just sailed, header that they just sailed through. So it's a balance, isn't it? Yeah, I think, and the more you go through that stage, I guess, of going out, we'll just go to set it up, focus on the racing, and then you get a bit more time and you go, oh, well, actually now we'll start tweaking things. And you probably almost go backwards before you go forwards again, because then once you've looked at it for a little while, okay, now that makes sense. You sort of refocus on, let's go sailing.
And how religious are you about recording settings and recording every outing, whether it's a training or a racing session?
At the big events I will do. It's quite easy. So just on sort of the J70 experience that I've got, so many people say, oh, do you actually use the tuning guide? And we do follow the tuning guide pretty much to the letter. So it's a pretty easy recording session of, we went out and we were 2 steps above base for the day. And it might, we may adjust it through the day, we may not, depending on the conditions. So that's pretty set. And we're not doing the whole, let's maybe try a little bit of a hybrid of tensions or whatever it might be. The actuals is probably a little bit more bespoke, a little more custom, because you're allowed to adjust the shroud tensions during the race. So quite often, you might be coming off the start line and maybe struggling for a lane, and it'll be a quick thing of, right, let's just take a couple of turns off the lowers and get some power into the boat, and maybe that'll help us get a higher mode off the start, hold a lane. So it's a little bit more dynamic on rig tune. So it's quite hard to record every adjustment, but you obviously kind of make a note of what the basics were and what you kind of started the race with. It just might not be anything like what you finish it with.
So if there's a variable forecast and you're not too sure what's coming in for the day, and it's difficult to change settings out on the water, how do you decide what the best compromise is?
Well, the classic thing is it's better to be overpowered in the breeze and than underpowered in the light. And it's pretty true in most classes that you can, if you go out and with a hard rig tension and the wind drops, the boat becomes really sticky really quickly. And that's the case in most classes. And vice versa, if you go out and you're slightly underdone for the weather conditions, regard tensions, you can kind of make it work. You might have to set up the sails a bit more twisted. Maybe you can use a bit more backstay, or maybe not, but you can sort of fudge your way around it a little bit easier. And then when you do get the lulls, you've got the performance to really take advantage of it. So if you have to do a bit of hedging, you classically sort of hedge for the bottom end of the range rather than the top end. If you don't know what's going to happen, if it's a massive range, you literally have to sit it in the middle and go, right, let's deal with it as best we can when it happens,
And do you have on most boats a sort of a mid-range? Maybe it is your sort of base settings for 10 to 12 knots. Is that you'll sort of get you through any kind of condition settings?
Yeah, so both the Etchells and J70s wise, the base tensions are relatively, they're around the sort of 10 knot setup. So sometimes if you're going in the Solent, for example, because they're international classes, that's what an international tuning guide looks like. Sometimes, again, for Solent, if you're thinking, well, the sea breeze is going to kick in, then you might sort of hedge. If you can't adjust during the race, for example, like on the 70, then you kind of hedge halfway there and say, well, we'll go, maybe one step up and look at, or two steps up and look at maybe we're getting to 14 knots kind of range, rather than it's going to be an 18 knot sea breeze and get there straight away sort of thing.
Yeah. Okay. Now, at the beginning of the conversation, you mentioned about sort of needing to make sure you're set up for upwind and downwind. I thought that getting around the windward mark would be the absolute priority. So downwind setup would absolutely take back seat to anything that you needed to do to get upwind as quickly as possible. Just tell us about that balance.
Yeah, so it is, but ultimately, there's no point kind of getting yourself around the top mark 100 yards in front of everybody and then being literally the world's slowest person downwind and people overtaking you left, right, and centre. So I think there's, the classic thing is you try and get to the top mark and sort of stick your elbows out for the downwind leg if you need to. But Etchells wise in particular, there's a lot of adjustments, so you're moving the mast heel position, and you've got a mast ram at deck level, so you can adjust the way the rig's going a lot of the in a lot of ways. But obviously, the further you, as an example, your breeze is building or the breeze is dropping, you want to move the mast heel back for when it's light to, in effect, create some pre-bend and flatten the mainsail or whatnot. And equally, when it gets breezy, you're moving the mast heel forward to help straighten the mast. That allows you to use more backstay. But it does mean that when you go downwind and you let the backstay off, if you've got the rig a long way forward down at the bottom of the rig of the mast, then it won't allow the mast to go forward as much downwind. And you sort of see extreme examples of that if you go and see a star sailing downwind and the rig's miles over the front of the rig, over the front of the bow. The Etchells is a little bit like that, but on a slightly throttled back. So you can set up perfectly for your upwind, but you're always trying to maximize it. You right at the kind of, well, let's get the mast heel as far back as I can kind of get away with, so that when you let everything off, when you do go downwind, you can get the tip of the mast and the hounds as far forward, and that just helps the spinnaker project away from the boat better downwind.
Yeah, got it. Okay. Now, the other factor, of course, is that a tuning guide might have been written by someone at North Sails like yourself, where the competence on board is extremely high. Everyone's hiking extremely hard. And therefore those numbers work to that particular professional setup. Any comment to make about that? Should there be a sort of should you take account of the fact that people may be less fit and less competent and set up the boat to be a bit more forgiving?
Yes, you can. It's probably so the Etchells with the fact, by the nature they've got a crew weight limit. Everyone's pretty much on that crew weight limit. and then you're down to the smaller sort of percentages, if you like, of how much you're hiking. Almost the bigger difference again is a J70 where you don't have a weight limit. So you can have a 4-man crew, you can have a 5-man crew. So some boats might be 310 kilos and another boat might be 400 kilos. So again, going back to the whole thing about being a Bible, it's kind of, you kind of setting up a tuning guide to be in the middle ground. And then if you're one extreme or the other, you just have to work out what's best to deal with. Obviously, a heavier crew, you're probably going to be, you're going to be going up from base a lot higher up the wind range than someone who's 80, 90, 100 kilos lighter than you. So I think that's where you get to just actually discuss, be it with me or with another sailor maybe that's done some time in their class, to kind of get a bit of feel for where you need to go. Otherwise, you've got a tuning guide for so many different variations. It'll be like literally reading an encyclopedia,
Yeah, that's true. What about sail choice in terms of are there some sails that are faster in the right hands, but it needs to be really well sailed because it's a narrower groove, and are there other sails that are a bit more forgiving, and therefore you would advise different sailors maybe to buy different types of sail?
Occasionally that is true, but what you end up doing is the sails in the small keel boats generally have to cover such a large wind range. As you go into, bigger yachts, for example, that, the range of head sails you've got racing yachts anyway, the range of head sails you've got increases massively. So they're designed for a sort of smaller wind range, whereas sails on small keel boats, you've generally got them for the day. The actuals you can measure in 2 jibs, for example, in big class. You've got effectively a light and a heavy jib, but there's quite a big crossover there because you just kind of need it. And ultimately, we could design a sail that's really kind of hard to steer to. It might be fine on the entry or something, a jib like that. But equally, the boat is moving around so much physically on the waves because they're relatively small. You need something with quite a big groove. So it's really hard to, it just becomes such a narrow groove at sail that, the best sailors will struggle to deal with it. So you've really got to design a sail that is pretty user friendly and has quite a big groove and has quite a big crossover.
Fair enough. Now, one of the things I hear increasingly in the Olympic scene is that the more different boats that you sail, the better you become at whatever you want to be world class at. So this diversification. And you've won 25 national championships in various dinghy and keelboat classes, 8 times in the solo single-hander in the UK, and you've won the J70 UK Nationals and the World Championships. You've won the Etchells UK Nationals and the European Championships. There's a lot of diverse experience that you've got there, but looking specifically at the J70 and the Etchells, both of which you're sailing quite regularly at the moment, how does the experience from one feed into the other?
It's actually, there's some similarities, but there's also it takes me a while to go from one to the other, so that sailing styles, tacking angles, setups by way of what you can and can't adjust. And obviously the big thing being, an Etchells with a symmetric spinnaker and a J70 with an asymmetric spinnaker. So it's ultimately they're kind of, yes, you're going upwind with two white sails up and you're tacking on shifts, but there's quite a reasonable bit of differences between the two. Not groundbreaking by any stretch of the imagination. It's not like we're falling on one and displacement the other, but they're relatively I guess different to sail. Whereas when I was sort of with the dinghy stuff I was doing, a lot of the single-handers, it's kind of running the similar thing. So phantom solos, fins, etc. There's a lot of similarities that you can take from one to the other without having to completely relearn how to sail. And it's probably with the J70 Etchells, there's a few more differences. And if I went from one J70 event to straight into the, which I've done, into the actual, some ley lines are all over the place. Yeah. So there's a few differences you got to remember about, for sure.
Okay, so yeah, you can't take that for granted. But do you think there's anything from your J70 experience that gives you the upper hand when you get into Etchells once you've got your eye in for ley lines and things?
I think just generally kind of fleet racing, whatever. I think wherever you can race in a good fleet with good numbers, in any kind of type of boat, reality, that is invaluable. With just regards to where to position your boat, or maybe starting concepts or things like that. Wherever boat you're racing, learning how to race, I think, is really important. And you can work out the setups and the differences, and you'll get used to switching boats and what have you. But actually learning how to race and put the boat in the right position is kind of invaluable. And then that's a big crossover for sure. Because they're both big fleets. You get a world championship and there's 80 plus boats generally in those sort of classes. So knowing how to put a series together is invaluable, I think, for both.
Now, my experience mostly in the dinghy scene is that when people are limited on time, they just want to go racing. They don't really want to do training, and they don't want to do two-boat tuning or any of that stuff, because that's just boring. Actually, I think if people tried it, maybe they'd find it would be more interesting than they think. But can you actually achieve world-class speed in a boat like the Etchells or the J70 purely through going racing and through the experience of racing?
Probably not, is the short answer. You can get a long way to it, and you might be able to pull out the odd good result. But I think when you get to a really big event and all the big teams are there, you'd struggle to do a really good event if you hadn't put the time in. And that's kind of the same in so many sports and so many classes, that you kind of need to put that extra time in to get that final level.
So how much is two-boat tuning, or maybe more than two boats? How much is that an intrinsic part of your campaign as you try to build the boat speed?
Well, I think just going with the J70, we did quite a few days before the Worlds in Torquay as a team. So that was a key part, was keeping the same team together. We've since done this year, we did a load of work with the Cyclops rig tune setup, and we were doing two-boat tuning in the J70 with that, which is really, really interesting. It's not something we've done that much before, to be honest. And what we did do was take the smaller, events in the Solent and say, right, what should we focus on? Let's use this as a bit of a training event. Let's try, focusing on pin end starts, or let's focus on downwind transitions between wing and high, lazy plane or whatever it might be, and just put a little bit of focus on a couple of core bits rather than just saying, right, we've got to win this event. So I think you can, by planning that around and looking at the calendar, you can say, well, let's pinpoint a few events. Let's pinpoint where we would like to get a good result, but let's work back and say, right, well, let's use this event to work on some, should we try some upwind trim changes or whatever that might be.
So some sacrificial events where you don't care so much about the outcome.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Now, tell us about the Etchells Worlds next year. There's quite a big focus for that. So where and when is that happening, and what plans do you have to take part?
Yeah, so in Cowes in September. So towards the end of the summer next year, it's I've done 2 Etchells Worlds from Cowes in the past, and be great events, albeit windy most of the time. And so I currently sail an Etchells with the same skipper who we also sail the J70 with, and I think it's going to be a great event. It's going to be quite a build up. There's a bit of fever in the class, getting people new people coming into the class, and existing sort of experienced guys ramping it up. I think it's always a great event out of Cowes, and I think we get all the good boats over here, get some good UK teams. And I think actually it's probably been the strongest there's potential for it to be the strongest UK GB fleet. There's already people putting the hours in, and new boats built, doing plenty of events. So yeah, I think it's got great scope to be a real beauty of a world.
And from a boat speed point of view, if you're targeting that championship, it's a very specific venue, isn't it? So just give us a sense of how you're approaching that from a boat speed point of view, knowing what you know about racing in the Solent. And you also mentioned September could be a windy time of year. So give us some insights there.
Yeah, so I think certainly what we mentioned before about, biasing upwind, downwind performance. I think Cowes is one of those venues where very tidal, you have to be kind of going fast in the right direction to take advantage of that. So I think it's one of those events where you need to be on the pace upwind so you can hold a lane or get to the corner or the side of the race course that you want to take advantage of the current. So you probably have a bit more of a bias of saying, right, we really need to make sure we're on the ball and fast upwind so that we can put our boat in the right position. And then downwind, then it kind of evens out a little bit more. But I think certainly, yeah, you want to be quick. And like you say, September could be a bit of anything. Could be late season sea breezes, or you just could get a system come in and it'd be 25 knots all day. So yeah, the number of times you go to an event and say, oh, it's never normally like that. Yeah, well, it could be 5 knots every day, and that's pretty much what we've seen this summer. Who knows?
Well, what you know is that the Red Jet fast ferry across that stretch of water is going to be going past you every half hour or so, if not every 15 minutes. There's a lot of traffic in that area. So do you have to set up for a chop and set up for a more powerful setup than normal?
Yeah, and you certainly have to. I mean, that's the nice thing about the Etchells, is because you can adjust shroud tensions. You've got mast run. There's lots of controls you can adjust whilst racing. You can power the boat up pretty quickly within, even if you see a big power boat cruising down the North Channel that you hadn't spotted, you can get the boat set up quite a lot of the way within 20 seconds, by adjusting some shroud tension and adjusting the mast ram or whatever it might be. So it's really nice for that, because you can be really mobile on your trim as well as just normal sail trim.
Well, Charlie, brilliant to chat to you. Any sort of final thoughts? I think we've covered a lot of ground, so I think we can probably stop it there. But just any final thoughts on the do's and don'ts, the things that people maybe do too much of and they don't do enough of? Anything that comes to mind? No,
yeah, I mean, it's just the classic, and of know your numbers. If you can know your numbers on shore and off and on the water, great, have them in the back of your head, but make sure you're still pointing the boat on the lift at the same time. I think that's probably where most people will get hung up, and then they spend, they come in and they spend half the days working out why they weren't fast, and it wasn't nothing to do with the rig setup. It was the fact that the sails were flapping halfway around the race course. So I think,
right. Yeah, well, we're all guilty of that from time to time, but the better sailors are the ones that can sail the boat fast and keep their heads out of the boat, I suppose.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, Charlie, great to chat with you. Good luck with the coming season. I'm sure many more championships are coming your way, so we'll watch out for that, and catch up with you in Cowes or somewhere sooner than that, I hope.
Yeah, definitely. Cheers, Andy.